Laborers on hazardous waste cleanup sites need specialized knowledge and training in order to work safely in a hazardous environment. Part of that knowledge includes an understanding of the laws and regulations that give laborers important legal rights. The most important worker safety protections come from the Occupational Safety and Health Act and the various Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, safety standards. The Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, or OSHA Act, is the most significant law protecting the health and safety of workers in the workplace. Although most of the major responsibilities under the law are assigned to employers, the Act imposes duties both on employers and employees. Under the OSHA Act, the law imposes very broad obligations. Basically, the law imposes two requirements on employers. First, employers are required to comply with all standards that are issued by OSHA. Second, employers are required to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards. In other words, regardless of whether there is a published OSHA standard that covers a particular problem on the job site, the employer has an obligation to try to eliminate from the workplace any hazard that is likely to cause death or serious physical harm to workers. This is known as the General Duty Clause. Workers also have responsibilities under the Act. The law recognizes that workers also play an essential role in making the job site a safe place to work. It is very important that workers comply with the OSHA regulations that have been issued to protect them. Until the mid-1980s, there were no regulations governing work at hazardous waste sites. As the nation's cleanup effort was getting underway, the absence of a safety standard for the remediation industry was becoming a significant problem. In 1986, Congress recognized the hazards that confronted workers during cleanup operations. Congress instructed the Department of Labor to develop safety and health rules for hazardous waste operations. The final OSHA standard for hazardous waste operations and emergency response was adopted in 1989. The regulation often is called the OSHA HWW standard. For laborers in the hazardous waste and environmental remediation industry, the HWW standard is an important document that establishes basic operational guidelines for employers and employees. Like many government regulations that address complex problems, the HWW standard is relatively long and detailed. In order to better understand the regulation, it is helpful to be familiar with the general structure of the standard. The standard is divided into 17 paragraphs. Each of the paragraphs deals with a different aspect of hazardous waste cleanup. Paragraph A of the standard identifies the regulation's scope and application and includes definitions of special terms. The next paragraph discusses the safety and health program of the site. Each employer whose workers are involved with hazardous waste materials is required to develop and implement a written safety and health program. This program must be made available to employees, subcontractors, and union representatives. The employer's safety and health program must include site-specific information, such as a comprehensive work plan for the site and a site-specific safety and health plan which should be kept on site. The OSHA standard requires that hazardous waste sites be evaluated by contractors to identify specific site hazards and to determine the appropriate safety and health control procedures needed to protect employees from the identified hazards. Paragraph C of the standard discusses the site characterization and analysis requirements. Hazardous waste workers must be informed by the contractor of any site hazards that are identified. The next paragraph of the standard talks about site control. Employers must implement site control procedures before cleanup work begins. Paragraph E discusses the training requirements of the standard. Worker training is a central part of the OSHA HWW standard. Employers must be certain that all workers whose jobs may involve exposure to hazardous materials receive both general training to prepare them for work in the industry, as well as site-specific training that addresses the requirements of the specific job site. The standard requires that all personnel working with hazardous waste receive a minimum of 40 hours of training. In addition, OSHA requires that workers receive a minimum of 3 days actual field experience under the direct supervision of a trained, experienced supervisor when they begin a job. When a worker completes training, he or she will be certified by their instructor and training supervisor as having successfully completed the necessary training. A written certificate will be given to each person. The next paragraph of the standard discusses medical monitoring. Employers engaged in hazardous waste operations must institute a medical surveillance program for their employees. Regular monitoring of a worker's health is an important part of the hazardous waste industry. By establishing a medical baseline for each worker and then regularly checking the employee's health, it may be possible to spot any health problems that develop early. The regulation requires that the program must be available at no cost to the worker, and that the medical professional take steps to ensure that an employee's right to confidentiality is protected in the event that non-work-related illnesses are detected by the testing. The paragraph titled Engineering Controls, Work Practices, and Personal Protective Equipment for Employee Protection outlines the steps employers must take to minimize the possibility that employees will be exposed to hazardous materials. Exposure monitoring is essential on a hazardous waste site. Paragraph H requires employers to implement a monitoring program if there is a possibility of workers being exposed to hazardous concentrations of hazardous substances. Monitoring should be conducted prior to site entry, and periodic monitoring should also be done as work progresses or changes. Paragraph I discusses the informational programs an employer must have for informing workers, contractors, and subcontractors actually engage in hazardous waste operations of the nature and degree of likely exposure. During hazardous waste cleanup, there may be times when workers are required to handle hazardous materials. Paragraph J details how drums and other containers holding contaminated soils, liquids, and other residues shall be handled, transported, labeled, and disposed of. Decontamination procedures must be developed for workers, clothing, and equipment in accordance with the regulation. Paragraph K of the HWW standard discusses the decontamination procedures employers must develop and follow for decontaminating workers and equipment. It is important that all hazardous waste sites have a plan developed and in place in case of an emergency. Paragraph L requires employers to develop a written emergency response plan and make it available to workers, union representatives, and government officials. Paragraphs M and N of the HWW standard discuss the requirements for having the proper lighting levels for visibility and the minimum specifications for the number and type of toilet, wash facilities, showers, and change rooms required at the site. Paragraph O of the standard requires employers to introduce new technologies and equipment to the hazardous waste cleanup site if the technologies are effective in improving the health and safety of workers. The new technology program also must examine technology, equipment, and control measures that will minimize the level of air contaminants during evacuation or for spill control. A separate paragraph addresses requirements for employers operating treatment, storage, and disposal, or TSD facilities where hazardous waste materials are processed or stored. Unlike uncontrolled hazardous waste sites where contractors often have a difficult time determining the hazards confronting their employees, the hazardous materials that are shipped to TSD facilities typically have been analyzed extensively, packaged, and then labeled. The risks to employees from handling these materials, therefore, are slightly different from the hazards found at cleanup sites. Paragraph P of the HWW standard contains specific rules for employers at TSD facilities. Paragraph Q of the HWW standard covers workers involved with hazardous materials emergency response at sites other than environmental cleanup jobs and TSD sites. Basically, this paragraph covers workers who play some role in responding to hazardous substance spills, explosions, fires, etc. This includes police, firefighters, hazmat teams, and skilled support personnel crews. Working on a hazardous waste site requires employers and workers to be aware of the requirements of the HWW standard. There are many hazards on the job, and being aware of the rules will help make the job safer. So be mindful the next time you're on a hazardous waste site. There is more to it than just reporting to work.